Hello, and welcome back to the next series of talks in the 2021 set of Open UK Future Leaders training sessions. Please note this meeting is being recorded and will be made available soon afterwards on our YouTube channel. First, a little about the Open UK Future Leaders Group. Future Leaders Group is a collection of individuals who are interested in open technologies, including open source software, open hardware, and open data. It includes a wide range of people that work in technology, intellectual property, outsourcing, procurement, data, coding, and innovation, as well as private practice lawyers and in-house counsel that work in the technology sector and related fields. It operates under the direction of the Open UK Legal and Policy Committee and has a clear purpose to bring together and develop future leaders in legal and policy matters relating to open technologies and to support and further the mission of the Legal and Policy Committee. The Future Leaders Group is currently co-chaired by me, Robert Grinnells, and I'm from Phil Fisher, and Katie Gibson from Bristow's, and we're both lawyers advising on technology and commercial matters. The group is always open to new ideas and to new members, whether getting involved in all of our activities or just dipping in and out of our various projects, so please do get in contact if you'd like to get involved. And for today's session, we're pleased to be joined by Andrew Katz and Sami Atabani. Andrew is the Joint Managing Partner and Head of Technology Law at Moorcrofts LLP and is CEO of Oroco Limited, a compliance business specialising in risk management around software supply chain management, with a particular emphasis on open source software. He was formerly a software developer, and Andrew qualified as a barrister in 1990 and subsequently re-qualified as a solicitor. He's Irish and British, and also an Irish solicitor non-practicing. Sami is the Director of Third-Party Licensing at Arm and an experienced Director of Intellectual Property with a demonstrated history of working in the semiconductor industry. He's skilled in IP licensing, open source software, embedded software, EDA management, commercial licensing, and business modelling. He is a strong legal and commercial professional with a diploma focused in management from the Institute of Management in the UK. So we'll have a chance for questions all the way through the session, so please do ask them of our speakers all the way through. We can also do them at the end, and we'll invite you onto Voice and Video to ask them if you'd like to. But Andrew and Sami, welcome to our session today, and thanks for joining us. And over to you to talk about OpenChain UK.
Fantastic, lovely. Thanks very much, Rob. Thanks for that very, very kind introduction. So we're going to run this on a fairly informal basis. So if anyone wants to leap in with any questions, absolutely no problem at all. So I'll make sure this button works. So we have a nice logo, OpenChain UK Work Group. What we're going to do is I'm going to explain a little bit about what OpenChain is. I think people who've been on a number of these sessions probably have some more in-depth information. That's going to be at a fairly high level. So if anyone needs a bit more specific information, I'm happy to take any questions on that at the moment. So this is us. This is actually me with less hair than I have at the moment, interestingly enough. So we have, Sami and I are sort of, instrumental in setting up and running this group. We started last year. We've had 4 meetings so far. Obviously, the plan was that in an ideal world, we would have actually met up in person, and there's quite a lot on the basis on which we arrange meetings on the OpenChain UK website, and there's links to that all the way through. And the next meeting that's coming up, we're planning to do that, I think on the 24th of June. So anyone is welcome to join. The website is openchain.uk, so it's pretty easy to remember. So let's give you a bit of background about what OpenChain is. It's a framework for defining an effective open source compliance program. And the idea is that this forms organizations that are compliant with OpenChain, and they form part of the supply chain. It really is intended to reduce friction and increase trust within the supply chain. Anyone who is developing software, which is inevitably going to contain a whole bunch of open source components these days, and then is passing that software on through different levels in the supply chain. If every member within the supply chain understands OpenChain and is themselves OpenChain compliant, then that is going to make the whole process much, much more straightforward. So what does it do? Well, it focuses on compliance of licenses. As you know, all the components that are contained within an open source project, all those components may well be subject to different licenses, and those licenses have subtly different requirements attached to them. So in order to ship software that contains open source components, it's necessary to make sure that you know what the licenses are and you know what you need to do in order to comply with them. And really the core of this is to track components, and to do that you need to have a bill of materials materials. And a bill of materials is nothing more than a list of all of the components that you've got in an open source software package, and you know what those components are, you know what versions you're using, you know what licenses are attached to those components, and you have access to all the information that you need to comply with the licenses. And if you have all of that information, then that enables you to do a whole bunch of other things as well. And we'll talk about those a little bit later. But fundamentally, it's about gathering together the information that you need so that you can very simply comply with the licenses when you're passing that code on to the next stage in the supply chain. So OpenChain is a framework for organizations to help that to happen, and it covers management and governance of the process, and it talks about having in place policies, practices, and procedures to facilitate all of this gathering of the information that you need and passing it on to the next stage of the supply chain as well. In order to do this properly, an organization needs to ensure that the people who are operating the program have appropriate training and competence. So OpenChain specification covers that as well. And then finally, one of the other characteristics is that a well-run open source program is going to understand how to engage with external open source projects. So all of that is included in the OpenChain specification, and as of December last year, OpenChain is now an ISO. It's an official ISO standard, and that's really sort of increased visibility significantly, but it's also made it a lot easier for people within organizations to go to the management team and say, we've got this issue around governance of open source, but the good news is that there is now an officially recognized way of dealing with that. And the fact that there's an ISO standard, it is now an ISO standard, really facilitates that process. Sami, I don't know if you want to sort of leap in and add anything to that at this stage.
I mean, I just want to sort of highlight some of the benefits, actually. I mean, the OpenChain framework is really aimed at building trust across the supply chain, and you do that by ensuring that there is consistency in the supply chain in how the information is conveyed from one supplier to the next one. And there is a huge benefit as an organization as to why you want to be on board. That it improves efficiency significantly. Certainly when I talk about the ARM experience, we found that actually there was a huge amount of duplication of effort, not just across the supply chain, but even within your organization, when you have multiple projects and multiple business groups. Having consistency is a huge improvement because it means that you don't need to duplicate effort, or one part of the business don't need to duplicate that effort. So and I can go on and on and on about these benefits, but in a nutshell, there is a huge efficiency, and that's something that I typically, when I talk to my senior management and the exec team, I sort of demonstrate sort of what are those improvements and the speed by which we get our approvals within the organization, the speed by which we are able to provide the compliance artifacts that are required in terms of and that has a direct impact on the business. If you're a commercial entity, you end up in lengthy contract negotiations. Having all of that information in a consistent manner really speeds up that negotiation process, because you have all the artifacts that another organization might require you to provide and need to look at it before they sign the dotted line.
Yeah, absolutely. So Yari's just raised a great question, which is, does a bill of materials include code snippets? And one of the things we'll cover later is the fact that OpenChain is just a framework, so it doesn't go into its sort of extreme detail about what is included. But you would normally expect an open source policy, a code inclusion policy, to contain something about code snippets. So any effective policy should have something in that deals with those. And ultimately, anyone downstream who is receiving code is going to want to know what all of the components are. And normally they will be the components, the sort of the standard components that you will find in places like npm or GitHub or whatever, and in almost all cases they will be unmodified from the version that is canonically available from the site that has created them, that hosts the project in the first place. So it's going to be, code snippets are likely to be included, but they're more likely to be in the custom code that has been generated by an organization. But because those code snippets will be subject potentially to other licenses, it may be that the policy should deal with whether they're likely to contain enough material to be considered subject to copyright and therefore subject to a license. But any third-party code really should be included within the bill of materials. So it may be that component X was developed in-house and we own the rights to that, but it does contain a number of code snippets which are licensed under the following license, for example. That it wouldn't be unusual to see that. I don't know, Sami, did you want to comment on that? Because you see this sort of in the flesh more frequently than I do.
Yeah, no, absolutely. It's a really good question, Yari. But just to give you an example, within ARM, we track every single version of our products that we license commercially. Within that, we require sort of a full list of what third-party IP is used and what are the applicable licenses and how that code is used. And then we part of the approval process, we require engineering to follow the guidelines in terms of what they need to do, whether it's supplying copyright notices and copies of the licenses, etc. So I would see this as a process that is evolving. So you see some organizations that perhaps do that at a slightly higher level. Some organizations do it at a finer granularity. But ultimately, the goal is that you need to know what third-party code is included in your software that you supply, and fulfill any obligations that are imposed by the copyright holder. Whether they waive that right, whether they don't, you just need to make sure that you have that full understanding of the bill of material. And certainly within ARM, we do that for open source, for commercial software. We do it for freeware. We do it for specifications. So we go with a fine tooth that we just want to know exactly what is included in our commercial products that we are supplying to our customers.
Yeah, and I think it was sort of a good point that you make there about other sorts of code that aren't open source code as well, because clearly the reality of software development means that you're going to be using a huge amount of open source code, but you're also potentially going to be using there could be proprietary components. There could be there's quite a lot of connectors, for example, from companies like Microsoft and Oracle, which aren't released under strict open source licenses. They're sort of open source like in that you can see the source code, but you're certainly not guaranteed all of those rights. And from the customer's perspective, they need to know about all of those equally. So although we're talking about an open source compliance program, the reality is that from the customer's perspective, they're going to want to know what all of those third-party components are to make sure that they comply with those licenses as well, which is why we don't get too hung up about the definition of open source within the OpenChain specification itself, because the reality is that everyone in the supply chain wants to know what all the components are, and they want to know what the licenses are attached to them, and whether that license is strictly counts as an open source license or not. From that perspective, it's not relevant. They just want to know what their rights and obligations are, and what they can do with the software, and how they're able to pass it further down the supply chain. Great. Okay. So, I mean, we've covered a lot of this already. Why OpenChain? The fact is, it's based on best practice that people were already doing. Before, and Sami's going to talk a little bit about the history of OpenChain because ARM was one of the early instigators of this. But it's basically echoes what a lot of organizations were doing already, albeit in potentially slightly different ways. And certainly, I've been advising on compliance for 20 years or so, and I come up with my set of criteria for what a quality open source compliance program looks like, and it's no surprise that it doesn't look a million miles away from OpenChain. So that was pretty helpful for those clients of mine that had implemented a program based on my recommendations, and then I could go to them and say, well, actually, you only have to tweak it here or there, and you'll end up being OpenChain compliant. And typically that's tweaking some of the areas around, for example, having a policy to engage with with external open source projects, and also tweaking some of the requirements around keeping training records, for example. But I've found that most companies that have a well-run open source program are already pretty close to being OpenChain compliant. So what's it for? Well, I mean, Sami's explained it reduces friction in the supply chain. That's the most important thing. So some of the things that it can do, it will mean that as a supplier, if you understand OpenChain, you're going to understand what your customers' compliance requirements are going to be. And there's an increasing number of customers who are starting to actually specify OpenChain compliance as part of their compliance criteria, and that's something that's only going to increase. It's happening quite significantly already within the automotive industry, but that is going to move externally into other areas as well. I don't know, Sami, have you spotted this sort of activity happening in other sectors?
Yeah, I mean, it does. I mean, the pharmaceutical, as you give there, is a classic one. There is a whole compliance and quality program that is typically run, and drugs before they're approved, they go through a fine tooth. I mean, the pandemic is a very good example. That taking that. But yes, absolutely, it is no different. It is about what as a company, what do you need to do to fulfill obligations that are imposed on you, and to have that consistency to avoid duplication of effort. And to be quite honest with you, if I reflect back, and I will talk about this in my section, 10 years ago, everything that you did with a supplier was a lengthy negotiation. You need to sort of do a huge amount of effort to fully understand what are the applicable licenses, and we will see over time improvement in that process, because, and have seen already, when an organization says we're OpenChain, it means that they're supplying you with that information that you're able to very quickly verify and be confident that actually you fully understand your obligations on the way out. And a company like ARM, we're sort of higher up the supply chain, so we really need to make sure that our end customers who pay us royalties are able to do business and to go into market so quickly that the more information you provide them up front, the easier it is for them to go to market.
Yeah, absolutely. So it's quite an easy sell within many organizations, because if they're used to compliance anyway, in different parts of the supply chain for other things that they're doing, then it's basically just applies similar sort of practice to software. So it's a reasonably easy sell, because there's nothing radical within it, and that always makes life easier. It's pretty flexible. It's designed to be able to work for companies of all sizes, and we've worked with companies that are just a handful of developers, through to companies that have thousands of developers. Obviously, the way that they implement it is going to be very different, but the ultimate the framework is exactly the same. And the reason for that is because the emphasis really is in terms of what organizations need to do and why they need to do it. but they can figure out for themselves how to do it and when to do it. So it's not prescriptive, and there are some standard hows and whens available. There's an open source template that we've developed, a policy template that we've developed that people can use, but there's absolutely no obligation to use any of those materials as well. They're just designed to make life a little bit easier for people to get on this journey. So OpenChain fits in with a number of other projects. Quite a few are also projects of the Linux Foundation. OpenChain itself is as well. So there's SPDX, Fossology, Open Compliance Program, and the To-Do group. So SPDX really gets down into the detail. And I mean, at its most simplistic level, for what it does is it allocates a specific machine-readable code to each of the different licenses, mainly open source licenses that are out there, so that it's very easy for a piece of software to look at some source code and then pick up the SPDX license identifier and then automatically use that to figure out what the applicable license is. But that is that's its main use, and it's extremely important use, but that's only sort of scratches the surface on its functionality, and it can do a lot of other clever things in terms of even allocating individual licenses to code snippets that are used within source code, and also there's some interesting developments as far as being able to have conditional statements that say that if you incorporate a particular component, then it means that the overall license has to be X, and so on. So that's quite exciting. But basically, it's a schema to make it a lot easier for people to be able to say, this is my code, this is the license that's applicable to it, and then to have that picked up automatically by other tools that can then allocate the specific license to that particular piece of code, so that they can create a bill of materials and apply a bunch of open source policies to it. Fossology is another project that it basically does code scanning and enables you to look at source code and easily extract information like license designators, including SPDX ones, copyright notices, license texts, so on and so forth. Open Compliance, produces a lot of mechanisms that assist with compliance process in general, and the To-Do group is a group of mainly large organizations that have set up effective governance structures, open source program offices within organizations, and there's an awful lot of materials that they've generated that are really useful to help you set up an open source governance program. And OpenChain is going really, really well internationally. So as well as the UK work group that we've set up, there's international ones in Japan, Germany, Korea, and Taiwan. India is a more recent one. They're focusing quite a lot on training materials, and that's going really well. And also the USA will catch up at some point with the rest of the world. It's starting to happen. And there's a bunch of different work groups covering different vertical markets and use cases as well. Automotive is very, very active. There's a tooling work group that's also active. That's been established for quite a long time. So that covers the various types of software that is available to help generate the bill of materials, store details of components, be able to generate compliance artifacts, and so on and so forth. Then there's a lot of work being done recently on education, and the Linux Foundation is providing a lot of support to that. So there's going to be some really high quality training materials that are being released. I think some of them have been released already, but there's a lot of really good stuff in the pipeline there as well. And then obviously around the development of the specification itself, the specification which is the core document of OpenChain. So that has been frozen as part of the ISO process, but we'll talk about this in a second. We're actively talking about extending that into, once you've got a bill of materials, there are various other things that you can usefully do with that. So there are sort of discussions about extensions as well. And then there's a partner network which covers professional service providers, which can help organizations with all aspects of open source compliance and open chain conformance. And that consists, on the one hand, of law firms, on the other hand, of more general compliance specialists as well. So there's a lot of big names behind this. You can see them there. The number is sort of increasing on an almost daily basis. Some very significant organizations are keen to get involved. These are organizations that actually have conformant programs. And there's also a lot of other large organizations who are working towards conformance but are not quite there yet, but equally big names as well. So, it's very well supported by the industry. You'll see there on the top left, ARM is very significantly mentioned as well, at which point I will hand over to Sami, who can tell us a little bit more about ARM and OpenChain.
Yeah, so thank you, Andrew. Sort of reflecting back, ARM has always done, as an IP company, obviously we've always taken knowing what's in our products very seriously. So there has definitely been compliance efforts for a long time, for as long as I've been at ARM for 26 years, and definitely we had effort, but it was actually a disjointed effort. If you know a bit about ARM, we're divided into or set up into sort of separate business units, as typical to many other organizations. And each organization or each part of the business unit were doing their own thing and their own interpretation of what they needed to do. In around 2014, we started to see a sort of open source and other third-party IP discussions when engaging with customers on commercial contracts. That these were brought up sort of regularly, wanting to know what's in the software or in the product that we're supplying, and more importantly, sort of what are the obligations that our own customers might need to fulfill when they use our products and when they use the open source components that are included within our products. So we started, and of course, from our customers' perspective, then negotiating contracts with ARM. They don't care whether it's the tooling group, whether it is the CPU or the processor group or the graphics group. They just want to negotiate and have consistency in the information that we're providing in relation to open source. So around 2014, we started to sort of look at how can we actually have a sort of a program that applies across the company, but meets the business needs of each individual group. And we set up sort of a core group. So, for example, my team was established with the remit of ensuring that we have a clear policy, we have a clear process that people can follow when they bring in any third-party IP into the company. And when I talk about third-party IP, that is could be commercial, could be open source, could be freeware, could be specifications that they want to use. So very, very wide sort of responsibility. So the team was established. We hired an attorney at that time, specialized in open source specifically. We hired another attorney who specialized in standards. To sort of ensure that we are really, whatever policies and processes we're putting in place are consistent and scalable. And it's interesting, Andrew mentioned about OpenChain. it was around 2014, 2015 that going into conferences like the Linux Foundation conferences or the FSFE legal and licensing workshop, that we started sort of to have discussions, and our lawyers were talking to lawyers from other companies, sort of joking. And again, it's actually something that Dave Marr from Qualcomm would laugh about when I mention this. Talking to sort of say, I bet you your process that you follow for compliance is no different. I bet you the training that you give is exactly the same as ours. And jokingly sort of saying, well, wouldn't it be great if we can collaborate and actually have a bit more consistency across? And that's how it started, sort of those informal discussions at conferences and those networking events that we started to sort of say, well, here's, if you show me your training material, I'll show you mine, and sort of and then suddenly realizing, they look very similar. Surprise, surprise. And that those were the discussions. So that was the inception of OpenChain, and one of the key drivers was around, well, actually, wouldn't it be great if when you give me your software, if I don't have to repeat the same process, if I don't have to scan, if I don't have to repeat the same process in trying to identify, is this all of it ARM IP? Does it contain other open source or other third-party IP? Wouldn't it be great if I have this information conveyed to me when you supply the product to me? So formally, sort of OpenChain was established, but internally within ARM, we started to look at having a consistent approach. We launched a ServiceNow application that basically anybody who wants to use open source has to follow the legal approval workflow to sort of say, I want to use this component or this package, and it is subject to these licenses, and I intend to use it in this ARM product, and that applied from 2016 across the company, regardless of the business group. We also used a tool called Anaqua to look at when we engage on a contribution or collaboration projects like the Linux kernel, for example. ARM does make contributions to the project. We wanted to actually also be able to track any of those contributions that we make to other externally hosted projects, to have a consistent approach, to know exactly who is responsible within the organization for managing those contributions, as well as also having consistency in what is good governance when we create our own open source projects like Embed OS, for example, or Pelion. These are ARM created open source projects where we're responsible for the governance of those projects. And again, establishing that collaborative effort within OpenChain was a game changer, because actually what we did at that time, and I'm really proud that ARM was one of the first companies to donate its training material to the OpenChain project, because we felt, if I know my supplier has received similar training to what we give our own developers and our own teams who interact with open source, that would be great, because when I talk to the supplier and talk about, well, I want the license compliance file, there is no ambiguity, there is no confusion about what sort of information I'm asking for. That sort of led, and interestingly, other companies followed suit. So Qualcomm did the same thing, and surprise, surprise, a lot of the training material looked very similar. And if you look today, I can spot in the OpenChain training material, I can spot which ones were ours, because we're still continuing to use the similar training material. Of course, it's adapted and adjusted. We also did something very crucial, and I'm a very strong believer. If I'm asking developers to do something or follow a process, that we have to make it easy for them to understand what they need to do. So we actually created what we refer to as a open source compliance playbook, where we said, if you're using GPL code and you're using it in this way, if you're modifying it, here are the things that you need to do as an engineer. And in our TPIP tracker, this is our ServiceNow application where we capture the approvals, we actually tell them exactly what they need to do based on this playbook. So engineers can look at this and sort of say, okay, I need to include copyright notices, include a copy of the license, very specific and very precise list of guidelines. So if you go a bit more forward, we then started to look at the OpenChain specifications. I think we started with version 1, which was the first version, and basically looked at every single component of the specification and started to do ranking. Where does ARM sit here? And what is missing? Where are the gaps? What do we need to change? And interestingly, we were doing quite a lot of it, just not recording things. And I think Andrew touched on this. A lot of organizations do training, but you don't always necessarily capture who has received that training, or you might do that on an ad hoc basis. But actually, we realized that this was a big gap, and decided what we're going to do is we're going to create, instead of doing the training and just providing slides to teams or recording to teams, we decided that we're actually going to do online training where we will roll that out to across the organization and record when people have completed that training. So really be very meticulous about what, who has completed that training. And that was the biggest gap that we had. And it took a long time, because for logistical reasons, using learning portals and ensuring that everybody has completed the quiz to ensure that they have a sort of a baseline understanding of what we mean when we talk about licenses or when we talk about open source. We wanted to sort of have that baseline clearly understood across the organization. And then we launched the training around sort of March, April 2019, and by August we were able to declare our conformance with OpenChain version 1.1 during the Open Source Summit in San Diego. So that was 2019. I'll talk a little bit more in the next slide about how we went. I talked about the gaps. We really looked at every single clause or point in the spec. And if you go forward, Andrew, we looked at, okay, do we have a document about the open source policy? Yes. Do we communicate that internal policy? Well, actually, we were communicating it, but actually it was not recorded how it was communicated. So we took that, for example, and added that to our overall policy that our employees have to accept every year. So really just a small change in that, sort of making sure that everybody understands that there is an open source policy and accept that this policy applies to every single individual in the company. Did we have the training material? Yes, we had training material, but actually it was not very clear whether the same training material was used across the organization or whether people modified it. So that sort of meant that some of the messaging to the different business groups might be slightly different because people interpret things differently. So again, quite a number of gaps that we had some, but not all of it, and it wasn't consistent. So if you go forward, Andrew. Then we sort of continued to look at the same components, and it took us quite some time, because you remember I said we had the training material, but we wanted to do it online. So it took quite some time to accomplish that task. If you go forward, Andrew. Again, I talked about the training material and that this was the biggest gap. Actually, we wanted something that is online. We wanted it split in a logical way. So we created 4 online training modules. And of course, we covered other things that as an IP company that we care about, that were not necessarily all open source related, but we just wanted to make sure that as an IP company, there is a baseline understanding of all aspects of IP law. So that we've done that. If you go forward, Andrew. And of course, we started to sort of tick the boxes, if you like, as to where are the gaps. And you know, I still kept some of the documents, the Word documents that we actually were ticking these lines. I'd have regular meetings with my legal team, and we go and say, right, we're here. What are the next actions? So really taking that pragmatic approach. If you go forward, Andrew. And of course, after we launched the training, we needed to ensure that the obligation that 85% of our software staff have completed the training. That was quite a bit of a challenge. Sorry, this has gone slightly the wrong way around, but you can go forward, Andrew.
Right, is that right?
and again, yeah, so we ticked all the boxes basically, yeah. And by the time we announced the conformance, that it was all completed. And of course, in 2020, we did announce our conformance with the 2.0. Again, there were a few gaps there, but we've taken exactly the same approach. We looked at the spec and just ticked the boxes. Where there were gaps, we just said, okay, we need to tweak our. It wasn't a huge amount of effort, but because of the pandemic, because of various things, it ended up being delayed. Originally, I was hoping that by December 2019 that we would declare our conformance, but it was just finding the time to just tick all the boxes was the issue.
Yeah. So, I mean, one of the interesting differences between version 1.2 and 2.0 is that in many ways it's actually easier to comply with 2.0 because there's more flexibility in there. And this is sort of fairly unusual. As things sort of develop, they tend to get, you know, cruftier and more complex and more specific. But the fundamental principle of OpenChain is really to keep, as I said earlier, just a framework. And we actually realized that, you know, parts of it were, specifically around training, actually were really too prescriptive. So it's now focused much more on what the outcomes need to be, and that in many ways has made it easier to comply with the newer version that it would have been to the older version, which is relevant to a question that Adrian asked, actually, which I will sort of cover later. Okay, Sami, anything else on that? That was really helpful.
I mean, the only thing I would say, collaborating with other companies is really a useful tool. You know, I talk openly to other people about our own experience and where they need to start. And again, if you're a company who didn't have a compliance program and looking afresh to sort of say, okay, I now need to have this consistency, I need to look at OpenChain. Look at it as a puzzle and start building those pieces of the puzzle together. And talking to other organizations who have gone through this process is really useful, because it removes that sort of overwhelming feeling that, oh my goodness me, you know, I'm never going to be able to do all of these things. But actually just ticking those boxes one by one, looking at the individual component, interpreting what it means, talking to others, what does this training mean? You know, we trained over 5,000 engineers, and it's a huge amount of people to train, but we just had seen the benefit, and doing it online, splitting into smaller modules where people can fit them in, what was the approach that we've taken, and it worked for us.
Mm-hmm. Yep, absolutely. Great, super. Okay, so where is OpenChain itself going next? Well, as I mentioned earlier, I mean, the key to all this is generating the bill of materials. Once you know what of all of the components you're using and what licenses and other information applicable to them, then you can do all sorts of other useful things as well. So security is one of those. Once you have the bill of materials, then there's a number of databases out there that will reference components with vulnerabilities. So you can immediately and very straightforwardly get some indication of whether the components that you're using have got potential vulnerabilities in them. Also, you may well be shipping components cross borders as well. There may be export controls. For example, the code that you're shipping may contain cryptography, which is restricted in some way. So knowing what is in there is going to help with your compliance with export control. And so both of those are currently under discussion as potential optional modules that you can add on to your existing OpenChain compliance. It may be the case that if you are shipping code, for example, within the automotive industry, it may be that the recipient also wants comfort that not only are you complying with all the open source licenses, but also that you have scanned the code for vulnerabilities against the most recently available vulnerability databases, and that's information that you'll be able to supply as well if you sign up to the optional security module. I don't think we're entirely sure what that's going to look like yet, but it's going to be very similar in spirit to the way that the rest of OpenChain works. And likewise with export control. Similarly, you'll be able to see whether there's any sort of issues around cryptography, for example, in there as well. Now, one of the things that I touched on earlier was open source community engagement, and this is really the only part of OpenChain which is a bit of social engineering on the part of the OpenChain core team, and the Linux Foundation is, clearly, people in the open source community regard engagement with open source projects as being a good thing. So in order to flag that up to organizations who are working in open source, it has been a requirement of OpenChain all along that there is a policy that deals with open source community engagement. Now, it's perfectly valid, although completely discouraged, for that policy to say we do not get involved in any form of third-party open source projects at all. Bad idea, but if you've got that in your policy, then you tick the box. So rather than trying to expand that and say, but you must get involved in external projects, and there may be good reasons why you don't want to do that. I mean, you may be highly secretive organisation within the military or something, and you don't want to get involved, particularly in external projects. So we thought one of the options is to add a module that says this is the way that we engage with open source communities. This is even less sort of prescriptive than the security and export control. Again, I'm not entirely clear what that's going to look like at the moment, but it's a way for organizations to say, we do actively get involved in external open source projects, and this is the way that we do it. And if anyone wants to join these conversations, they're all very, very welcome to do so. Everything that OpenChain does, development process, publications, membership, etc., is all terribly open and transparent. It's on openchainproject.org. But anyway, I'll provide the URLs on one of the slides later. So what's going on at the moment is there's a lot of work involved in improving the education and training and providing explainers to make it easier to sell OpenChain within the community and to organizations, and also they're working on formal certifications at the moment as well. Our compliance business Orcro provides formal certification process, and we divide that into two different sorts of certification. Program certification, which basically says that you have in place a set of policies, practices and procedures which if implemented, will mean that you are OpenChain compliant. And then we also offer system certification, which is basically more of a look back and says that we've been operating these programs, practices and procedures, and that they have proven to be compliant. So in that sense, it's more like a sort of financial audit. Essentially, you can have program certification almost from day one, but system certification requires that you've been operating the program for a while and that you can demonstrate that it's actually worked. So there's a number of other things that you can do with OpenChain, some of which we've discussed in the context of these training sessions. So it's quite useful to be able to use it as a framework for due diligence in corporate transactions involving where the target is an organization that is developing software. So basically one of the questions that an acquirer or a funder wants to know is, do you have a sensible way of controlling IP risk as far as open source is concerned? And one of the answers to that is, yes, we're OpenChain compliant. But basically, since OpenChain does define what a quality open source compliance program looks like, then you can essentially use it as a tick box against any compliance program, whether somebody formally says they're OpenChain compliant or not. It's a useful way of checking to see whether the actual practices and procedures that they're using make sense in context as well. And you can also expand it beyond software. We're looking with one client at the moment about expanding it into the world of open hardware as well. There's another interesting question as to whether it can actually be used as a federated way of applying in other areas. Quality assurance is one of those that we're potentially looking at the moment. I won't go into that in any more detail unless somebody specifically asks me to. But this isn't something that the OpenChain project is looking at. It's just something that I'm looking at as a possible way of being able to apply the quality. Federated quality control in things like disaster relief, smaller organizations, basically. So now directly onto the question that Adrian very presciently asked. OpenChain was originally designed and continues to be developed on the basis that it is to be used in commercial organizations. But it's also possible to extend it to other organizations as well. So there's the Ditto project, and if Amanda wants to break in and tell us anything about that, very, very happy to listen to her. But essentially this is a project within the NHS. It's a foundation. And they very much wanted to be OpenChain compliant. But the problem is that it stands at the moment. Some of the requirements of OpenChain are very difficult to apply to foundations because things like, the implication is that anyone in an open source project who is contributing code to the core project would have to have gone through all of the training processes, etc. And one of the great strengths of the open source development process is that really it should be as simple as possible for anyone to participate in the development of code. They should be able to just go onto GitHub, GitLab with their account, and if they can see that they can improve something, they just issue a pull request. So to add another layer of activity reduces that friction and makes it more complex. So basically what we have developed, and this is publicly available, we've developed a policy that basically says, if you're just a general contributor to a project, then you don't have to have been through all the training process. You don't have to understand our OpenChain policies and procedures, conformance, etc. You can just contribute in the normal way. We ask you to have a look, and if you will, want to go through any training, etc., that will be great, but that's not a requirement. The important thing is that there is a gatekeeper, somebody who has been through all of that training and does tick all the requirements of OpenChain, who makes the determination as to whether that particular contribution is accepted or not. And that's the way that we make it work. And we've discussed that quite extensively with some of the leadership team at OpenChain, and they're quite happy that that is a sensible way to proceed. Sorry, go ahead. Yeah.
on that point specifically, the specification 2.0 gives that level of flexibility
Yes,
because it
exactly,
sort of
exactly.
remove this obligation from training individual participants in a program to saying if you have in your framework, sort of a way of ensuring that it is controlled, then that's the way to do it. So, for example, the gatekeeper who receives or the person who approves the use are able to validate that and they're adequately trained, then that would be sufficient. I mean, we have chosen to continue still with the training of our developers, including members of our legal teams have to do the same training just so that they know they know what the developers have been told. But again, at the principle of it, if you have the framework that ensures that these controls are put in place and the people who review these requests are qualified and trained, then that would be sufficient.
Yeah, absolutely, absolutely. So, this is why this policy would not work under version 1.2 of OpenChain. Version 2 it does. Version 2 is the version, well, actually version 2.1, which is functionally identical. That was just tweaked very slightly. I think there's some paragraph numbering has changed or something, but that's the version that's been tweaked to submit to ISO. So the ISO version is technically version 2.1, and as Sami says, it's perfectly possible for you to apply that to a foundation. And there are, I mentioned earlier that OpenChain also works for other sorts of licenses that are not open source licenses as well, and it could work in different areas. I mean, I'm working on a project at the moment involving a lot of open data, and it also makes sense to apply an OpenChain like structure around that as well. And that may be something that becomes an optional module later on. Sort of wrapping up now, just one question I noticed from Amanda, is there any work on security? Yes, there is a specification work group that is working on security at the moment, so details of that are on the OpenChain website. Anyone is welcome to join that work group as well. So where are we going next? As far as the UK? Sorry.
Again, Andrew. And that group is open to all. Like every other working group, it is open for all. You don't have to be a member or a platinum member to specifically get involved. That is open to everyone to participate. And I would strongly encourage people to do that, because you will establish your network, and you will hear, you'll be able to collaborate with others, to influence, and also to learn from what is expected, and to sort of help you with the interpretation of what is needed.
Yeah, absolutely. So, I mean, virtually all of the activities of the OpenChain project are sort of open and transparent, open for anyone to participate. It's only some sort of specific areas, like the sort of partner group where you have to be a partner, and also some specific meetings of the actual platinum members, etc. But almost all of the meetings are open to anyone, and also almost all of them. I think actually all of the materials are also available to everyone as well, and also under a very non-restrictive license. The default is CC0 as well, so not even attribution is required in most cases. So from our perspective, we're keen to drive the working group forward in the UK. Next meeting is planned to be on the 24th of June, and we need to get to the stage where, are there any particular areas that we want to focus on in the UK? The different working groups throughout the world tend to have slightly different focuses, and that's absolutely great. If there's any particular focuses that people want to apply to the UK working group, then that makes a lot of sense to us as well. So sort of things we might be interested in are training and education. It could be that we're interested in developing particular sorts of tooling, maybe changing the emphasis and examining other areas like open hardware, for example, or it could be just vertical markets. I mean, for example, in Germany and Japan, there's a lot of focus on the automotive industry. It could be the case that maybe there are vertical markets that we wanted to look at in the UK as well. But that is by no means driven by Sami and me. That's really sort of driven by the members of the work group. Anyone is welcome to come along to the next meeting. So there's a bunch of useful links on there, sort of pretty self-explanatory. So I'm not going to run through those.
Andrew, sorry, just to interrupt. Adrian just asked the policy specifically. That is also in the reference material. That is now on GitHub. Is that right?
Yeah, that's correct.
Okay.
You can get to that through the resources link that's on the slide there. So if you click on that, that'll take you through to a page of resources, and one of those it directly refers to the open source policy. Okay. So that is available. Yeah, absolutely. Right, fantastic. So that's it from us. If there's any more questions, be very, very happy to cover those. But failing that, thank you very much indeed for your time. It's been a pleasure talking to you.
Yes, great. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you so much for your talk today, Andrew and Sami. I really, really appreciate it. Just another second in case there are any other questions. Feel free to ask them over voice and video or over the chat, but I think that might be it. So thank you again for your talk. It's been really, really fantastic. And just to let everyone know, so next week we will be joined by Ashley Monagle, and she's a digital transformation consultant at Mott MacDonald and the Open UK Digital Inclusion Lead, and she'll be talking to us about digital twins. So do go and sign up for that now on our Eventbrite link. The link is on the Open UK events page. And unless there's any other questions, then thanks everyone for joining, and thank you for our speakers today. Cheers.
Thank you, everyone.
Okay, thanks everyone. Bye-bye.